we're looking at the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle. And many learners, when they look at this diagram and they look at the amount of information that's shown here, they find it very overwhelming and they get confused. Right? But we're going to try and break it down for you. And you're going to hopefully find and understand that there's a very, very step-by-step systematic method in which this diagram works, which can make it much easier for us to understand. Before you can get there, you need to have a basic understanding of the female reproductive system. You should know the different labels as well as the functions of the different structures there. Then you should also realize that the menstrual cycle is not the same as menstruation. Menstruation is one very small part of this cycle, but the menstrual cycle is actually made up of two cycles. We're looking at the uterine cycle, where we look at the changes in the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus. We're going to look at the changes, how it gets thinner and then thicker, etc. And we also look at the ovarian cycle, where we look at the changes that occur inside of the ovary. We look at the follicle, how it changes, and eventually the corpus luteum, how that also changes. If we look at the information, as I was saying, it's in a systematic manner, the way in which it's arranged. So if you look at the information on the top, we've got the hormones from the pituitary gland grouped together. So those two hormones, FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and we've got LH, luteinizing hormone. Those two are together because they come from the same gland known as the pituitary gland, which is at the base of the brain. After those two, we have the ovarian cycle shown, where we've got the changes that occur in the ovary. And these changes are as a result of the action of the two hormones from the pituitary gland. So you can see the link that the hormones from the pituitary gland, they work within the ovary. And we've shown the changes in the ovary. The ovary secretes two hormones, namely estrogen and progesterone. Right, so estrogen, the O is silent, but we'll just maybe pronounce it as oestrogen so that for examination purposes we can then spell it correctly. So these two hormones, estrogen and progesterone, they are released from the ovary, and these two, they are responsible for the changes that occur in the endometrium, which is known as the uterine cycle. Lastly, we also have the days shown there as your kind of x-axis. And towards the end, there's also changes that will depend on whether a lady was pregnant or not. So the easiest way to go through this would be to actually block off the other days and look at it piece by piece and see what's happening step by step. So firstly, if we look at the cycle commences on day one. Day one is the first day of menstrual bleeding, where we find that the endometrium is shed, torn off, and this endometrium, along with blood and the unfertilized ovum of the previous cycle, is released through the vagina, and that is known as the process of menstruation. So the first thing that occurred was menstruation. And at the same time, if we look at the hormones, estrogen is level, progesterone is low, LH is low. The one that has increased is FSH. So from the pituitary gland, we've got the release of FSH, and FSH we know stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So follicle stimulating hormone, it is the name gives you an indication of what it does. It stimulates the follicle to develop. So that is follicle stimulating hormone. By knowing the name, we already got an idea of the function. So this FSH from the pituitary gland, it will work in the ovaries. It will be carried by the blood to the ovaries. And this increase in FSH will cause the primary follicles in the ovary to start to develop. To develop, we mean to say it is growing. So the primary follicles start to grow and increase in size as a result of follicle stimulating hormone. If we look at the next few days, we find that the follicle continues to grow as a result of the follicle stimulating hormone. This follicle, it releases the hormone estrogen. So this oestrogen is released by the follicle. As the follicles increase in size, we find that the oestrogen levels are increasing. The function of the estrogen, it will be carried with the blood from the ovary, and it will work now in the uterus. So from the ovaries, we get the estrogen released with the blood. It will go to the uterus, cause this endometrium lining to thicken. So after menstruation, we had the endometrium, which became very thin. Now estrogen will increase, and it causes the follicle, so it causes the endometrium to increase in size and to thicken. When the level of estrogen is very high, that would be an indication that the follicle is very large. This large mature follicle is known as the Graafian follicle. So that high level of estrogen from the ovary, it's in the blood. When that is picked up by the pituitary gland, the pituitary gland would now know that a high level of estrogen indicates that the Graafian follicle is ready and there's a mature ovum within there. And this pituitary gland now will secrete LH, and this occurs approximately on day 14. So we have LH released. LH, again coming from the pituitary gland, would work in the ovary. And what LH does is it triggers the process of ovulation, where the mature Graafian follicle bursts, it ruptures, it releases the ovum. The ovum then will be picked up by the fimbriae of the fallopian tube and will enter into the fallopian tube. Thereafter, the empty follicle, which did not have a ovum anymore, will then form into what is known as the corpus luteum, and this occurs within the ovary. So the empty follicle in the ovary now forms what is known as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone. So corpus luteum within the ovary secretes the progesterone. As a result, after day 14, you'll start to see an increase in the level of progesterone. You're going to find that progesterone is increasing here because the corpus luteum is secreting that progesterone. And the function of progesterone is that it maintains and further thickens the endometrium. We also say that it makes the endometrium more glandular and vascular. So we find that the endometrium now has been further thickened. And what happens next in the next few days depends on whether there was fertilization and implantation. So if there is no fertilization, then what happens is that the corpus luteum shrinks, it degenerates or disintegrates. So we find that now the corpus luteum has decreased in size. The function was to secrete progesterone. So if it decreases in size, we find that the amount of progesterone decreases, and progesterone was maintaining the endometrium. So as a result, the endometrium is no longer maintained. If the endometrium is no longer maintained, it now starts to shed and break up, which is menstruation, and therefore we start the cycle again back to day one. Remember, it's a cycle. It doesn't end at day 28. After day 28, it goes back to day one. That is a cycle. And we find that the FSH would increase again because there's a negative feedback mechanism between progesterone and FSH. Progesterone will inhibit, stop, and slow down the secretion of FSH. But if progesterone goes down, this allows FSH to increase again, and the entire cycle would repeat itself. However, if fertilization and implantation did occur, what we find is that the corpus luteum is maintained. The corpus luteum remains large in size, and it would therefore continue to secrete progesterone. So the progesterone level will remain high. If progesterone remains high, it will continue to maintain the endometrium. And now within the endometrium, you would have the blastocyst, which would have implanted therein, and it would start to get nutrition from the endometrium. So the gestation or pregnancy would have started by now. And there would be no menstruation if there is pregnancy because the endometrium is being maintained. Now, just to talk a bit more about the relationship between progesterone and FSH, I like to explain this by talking of a seesaw. So the relationship between the two is similar to a seesaw or a mzwinki as we know it where I come from. So we find that progesterone is the main one. So progesterone is the pregnancy hormone. So let's say this one is pregnant. She looks a bit young to be pregnant, but anyway. So if she's pregnant, then her weight would be more. And that's the one that's in charge of this process. So she's the one, as she goes up, progesterone goes up, FSH will go down. If progesterone goes down, FSH goes up. When progesterone is up, it will inhibit FSH. That's the wording we use, keeps FSH down. And that's important because progesterone is known also as the pregnancy hormone. There'll be secretion of progesterone throughout pregnancy, and that would keep FSH down. And that would make sense because if there's a high level of progesterone, that would be if there was fertilization or pregnancy, then you need to keep FSH low. And the reason for that would be that FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. If a woman is pregnant, we don't want to stimulate the development of new follicles because she is already pregnant. We don't need new follicles at that stage. However, if she's not pregnant, then we have progesterone going down. And so if we said that there was no pregnancy, no gestation that has occurred, no fertilization, then we have a decrease in progesterone. And if progesterone goes down, that will allow an increase in FSH. And an increase in FSH will now allow a new follicle to develop in the next cycle because the woman did not fall pregnant in the current cycle. The next cycle will start and FSH will increase to prepare a new follicle for possible pregnancy in the next cycle. Right. So I hope that this has maybe clarified that process or given a better understanding of that diagram. If you're not sure, you can go back and watch the video again, and hopefully it gives a better understanding of that process.